Good evening. The sunset may be viewed in black and white, but if we look at it this way, it loses nearly all of its appeal. Most of the beauty that remains is in the furthest extremes, the blackness of the horizon, the blinding white of the sun. All the rest is a commingling of grays. But most of the beauty comes from the colors, I feel. That's not just where most of the detail lies, but also most of the ambiguity. The colors, the sensation of the air, and the uncanny odors. It is as if the gases themselves can detect that they have entered a liminal space and must all undergo a rite of passage. The laws of the day are subverted, and the atmosphere experiences a wild communitas. The clouds seem to turn upside down, and it is at this time when we are most liable to foresee a coming storm. Even the birds at this time perform their auguries, birds migrating from strange faraway lands, or even just locals taking to the sky to evade some local dangers of the night. The bats conduct similar ceremonies at this time, but they do it batwards. There are those creatures who fly nocturnally, and those who favor the day. And then there are those who dwell in the sunset, the crepuscular ones, the barred owls, the night jars, the chimney swifts. For them, it seems all of time is like a dream, or rather, what we consider an ephemeral dream they view as the norm. Why not sleep all day and all night? Have your pancakes and eat them with a pinch of Schrodinger's salt. The inverted is the unverted. The saucer resauces. The sunset is the best time for a UFO viewing, because at night all one sees are ambiguous sources of light or nothing at all. And in the day, one can only see things in a stark relief against the brilliant sunlight. But in the twilight time, things are viewed under a constantly changing light, so the UFO can see things under every light at sunset. They don't just see a static and simplified version of things, they get to see things in 1,000 different ways. After all, a UFO witness is not just the beam of a flashlight, nor are they just a small pushpin on the map of the Earth. Rather, the witness exists across all of their complexities and all of the dimensions by which they may be scanned and measured, just like the UFOs themselves. We do not just exist in inky black and milky white. We exist under every kind of light. With the playoffs in full swing, the South Torrids are looking ready to finally make the championships. But next week, the North Torrids are all set to make a comeback, just like the last 20,000 seasons. And ETs complain that humans can't see them for what they truly are, only the awful stereotypes perpetrated by the media. But this is nothing new, say Marian apparitions. Plus, white nose syndrome. It's not just Batman on a coke bender. It's much worse. All this and more tonight. I'm Rachel Nelson.
I'm Jeff Knox.
Welcome to UFO Sunset. Now, if you'll just give me a moment here, I have to adjust my teleprompter really quick because it is not working properly. Okay, let's try it this way and see what happens. Is everybody ready? You ready, Jeff?
Ready. Prepared.
And now for the rebrief. The Halloween fireballs are upon us. Tomorrow night is the peak of the South Torrid meteor shower, the first of two. The North Torrids will also peak a week later on Monday the 11th. The South Torrid and North Torrid meteor showers are visible September 23rd through November 12th and October 13th through December 2nd, respectively. This means that this week is the ideal time of the season for viewing shooting stars and bolides, especially tomorrow and next Monday. These showers get their name from the fact that they mostly appear to emanate from 2 points in the sky, called radiants, in the constellation Taurus. Taurus, the bull, is one of the 12 constellations of the zodiac, and is located near the constellation Orion. It contains the star Aldebaran and also houses the Pleiades star cluster, which is very near the North Taurids radiant. The South Taurids peak is also referred to as the Halloween fireballs because this peak lies so close to Halloween. The main Taurids and related but less visible showers in June and July, called the Beta Taurids, are associated with the comet 2P Encke. According to an article by astronomer and skeptic Phil Plait, the June 30th, 1908 Tunguska event, a giant explosion over the Siberian taiga, originated from the same direction as the Beta Taurids, and was likely caused by a large Taurid comet fragment. A Washington man was imprisoned for killing thousands of birds. A man from Cusick, Washington, who was accused of heading a wildlife trafficking ring on the Flathead Indian Reservation in Montana, was sentenced to nearly 4 years in prison on Thursday. The man orchestrated the killing of 3,600 birds, including at least 118 eagles and 107 hawks. The trafficking ring killed the birds to sell their feathers and parts to Native Americans for their use in ceremonies. According to Mona Iannelli, special agent of the Fish and Wildlife Service, the illegal operation was especially interested in the black and white feathers of juvenile golden eagles, which are, quote, highly sought after, unquote. The culprit, Travis John Branson, apologized to his family and told them he loved them. He was quoted as saying, quote, "I know what I did was wrong," unquote, in the Daily Montanan. According to KPAX News in Missoula on Thursday, Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes chairman Mike Dolson was quoted as saying, quote, "We are going to feel the impacts of the Flathead Reservation's raptor loss for years to come. We hope this helps put a stop to illegal poaching on our homelands and gives these birds a chance to recover. Eagles are not only a treasured and important part of the reservation's ecosystem, but they also have a profound place in Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes' cultural and spiritual practices." On Saturday, Hameen James, vice chairman of the Coeur d'Alene tribe, who reside in parts of Idaho, Washington, and Montana, responded to the trafficking ring's activity according to KREM News in Spokane. James said that the eagle is cherished as an overseer and intermediary between humans and the spiritual world, which is why they are used in ceremonies. James said, quote, "It makes me sad as an Indian person. At no point in the history of the Coeur d'Alene tribe or Indian people in general have we ever condoned the thoughtless and the emotionless taking of these animals." Unquote. Since 2016, the Coeur d'Alene tribe also opened an aviary for eagles, which takes in those who aren't able to survive in the wild. The aviary also serves to educate the public, as well as collect the feathers that the eagles molt every year to be distributed to tribal members. An invasive white fungus is threatening North American bats. On Monday, the California Department of Fish and Wildlife reported that a parasitic fungus has been detected in bat populations in 5 counties in California. The fungus, called Pseudogymnoascus destructans, causes a condition called white-nosed syndrome. This is because the fungus creates a white fuzz on the faces and wings of bats affected. The fungus invades the skin cells of bats and damages their wing membranes. It also causes bats to end their winter hibernation early. The bats then deplete their fat reserves while food and water sources are still scarce, causing them to dehydrate and die. The fungus was first detected in Humboldt County last year, and then this year in Sutter, Placer, Amador, and Inyo counties. The fungus may also be present in bats in various other counties of California, where laboratory tests have been inconclusive. Bat species in California on which the fungus has been detected include 3 species of mouse-eared bat, the big brown bat, the Mexican free-tailed bat, and the first case of a western red bat ever reported. The white nose syndrome itself has not yet been observed in California bats, but the presence of the fungus suggests this condition may appear in the coming years. The fungus originated from caves in Europe but was discovered in New York in 2007. It has since spread to other parts of North America. According to a report published by the New York Academy of Sciences in October, white nose syndrome and other diseases are the biggest threat to North American bats. 3 species of mouse-eared bat, including the little brown bat, Indiana bat, and northern long-eared bat, have declined by more than 90% because of the fungus. The report authors also found that over half of the 153 bat species they studied face a risk of extinction in the next 15 years, while around 90% of species will face declines in population. All right, and so now, before moving on, a few notes of upkeep. First of all, I just want to say thank you to the people who are watching. Welcome, Rich. Thank you for joining us tonight. I know you can't always make it. Also, thanks once again to Martin Codmeyer for his thorough critique of our book club on the Nigel Watson chapter of Reliability about the Hill case. Oh wow, Jeff, you've got some sort of dolly zoom effect going there for a second. Very dramatic. And also, another note is that Luis Cayetano has left the show, unfortunately. He will no longer be joining us. He's moved on to pursue other projects. However, I'm sure he will still be doing a lot of really wonderful work, and we wish him the best. Thank you so much, Luis, for participating in the show for so long. It's been really wonderful to have you.
Yes, thank you, Louise, for joining us. I appreciated all your contributions. Sorry to see you go.
Yep, Rich caught the reference. Chief Brody and Jaws. I don't know. That's one of the really early famous uses of the dolly zoom. I don't think it's the first one though, right? Wasn't it used in like Vertigo or something like that? I feel like Hitchcock was the first person to use the dolly zoom. Anyway, completely unrelated. Jaws, though, is kind of UFO adjacent because it was a Spielberg movie and it was the first blockbuster. So it basically laid the groundwork for Close Encounters of the Third Kind that came out a few years later.
You mean like his first blockbuster?
It was the first blockbuster.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, there were movies that were, of course, like shown in cinema nationwide and stuff like that. But
You got like the Ten Commandments that did 140 million back in 1955.
yeah, like I said, I don't mean that it's the first movie that grossed a lot of money, but that it was the first movie that was marketed
It's a good
in
movie. Yeah,
the
I like
particular way that it was, basically. Like the way that movies were marketed in the popular movies like Star Wars were marketed in the 70s and 80s was kind of like a new way of marketing movies that wasn't done previously to Jaws, basically.
Sounds good. And it led to like you said, Close Encounters and E.T. and all sorts of fun Spielberg movies that came after. So,
yeah. Okay, and what else? Another announcement is that this is going to be our last book club of the year, and we're going to have one more Ufos episode, hopefully. But I think one valuable lesson I've learned from this project is that I should just not make any promises. And I think we should just make stuff and not announce it until it's done. Because otherwise, I'm just going to make promises and not keep them. And I must apologize for all of the times that I've done that.
that's right. I think we've been pretty good with keeping on schedule, for the last long while anyway, since we've been back on pretty much. So
yeah, there's been a couple of delays, but
yeah, a couple of times we had to call things off but on the most part.
But yeah,
it's a lot of work putting it, coming up with, an hour, 2 hours, or even sometimes 2.5 hours of content every single week, to talk to people about. So
yeah, I think that we have met many of the goals of this show. All of the most fundamental ones, I feel. It's been very substantive. It has been. I think that I've done some good, engaging work. I don't know. It's difficult. It's been a lot more difficult than I anticipated because we weren't, we did not set out to do just like a talk show or anything like that. We wanted to do something that was really providing substantive pieces, basically, that were based on research and, at the very least, reading of other substantive works.
I mean, yeah, like that's, people used to ask me when I, first got on UFO Twitter, is like, well, how come you don't do a YouTube show? How come you? And my response was always just like, man, everybody and their mom has like a podcast and a YouTube show, and almost none of them add anything substantive to like the actual topic. Like they almost all just like review that week's disclosure news, or whatever happened in the UFO world that week. And I mean, that's fine. I guess there's value to that, but I just like did not want to just start into something to where like we weren't really doing anything different than anyone else. Like I wanted to be part of a show where we're actually like sharing well researched like material that other people aren't talking about. So, and I think we've done a lot of that, and this show's allowed me to spend more time doing deep dives and actually like digging into some of like these cases. Whereas like I'm kind of almost robotic. I kind of get stuck in my patterns of like what I do every day, and like without the show, I'd probably just keep working on building the cases that I post every day and not really digging that deep into any of them, because I have a limited amount of time, each day. Like I can't do a deep dive in all the cases I post every single day. But this show has actually allowed me to dig in really deeply into some of the cases that I think are interesting, so that I can share them with people. And I think in quite a few of them, I've turned up some information that wasn't turned up before, and came up with some kind of potential solutions or answers, and other things that weren't widely being talked about. So I think it's been very beneficial, at least for me personally. I hope it's beneficial for people that watch. So.
Yeah, I hope so as well. And I don't want to speak ill of other people's work out there, because I think, well, for one thing, I don't really watch very many UFO shows or really listen to very many UFO podcasts. I mostly listen to more like para-weird occult stuff. And I think that there are some good podcasts and shows out there. Like I always really like Our Strange Skies and EFR, of course. I watch Expanding Frontiers research their shows. I watch pretty regularly, and The Invisible Night School I thought was really great. It was very interesting approach, and they actually really covered a lot of really important stuff. And
There's only like a handful of shows like that I watch these days myself. But 10, 15 years ago, I was like a lot of UFO Twitter. I binged all the UFO radio shows back when they were on the radio, and all the UFO podcasts. And podcasts were a thing back then too. They're just there was a lot of them back then as well. And I used to listen all week long. It's like every day I'd be listening to stuff all day long, and it just eventually got to the point where so much of it was the same, or stuff I'd already heard before, I already knew about, like that. I couldn't keep up listening to everything, and so I've limited it down to pretty much the kind of shows that you mentioned as well, are the things that I have the time to tune into these days.
I was going to say something else. Oh yeah, another thing is that we are going to be returning next year. And we have lots of surprises in the works. I don't know if that's the right way to phrase that. There will be there will be explosive disclosure, just uncontrollable disclosure happening. It's just going to be.
This is news to me too.
Glooge all over the place.
Yeah, this is news to me. So I'm suffering from ontological shock right now about this imminent catastrophic disclosure. So
yeah, I shot an arrow, AARO, straight into your heart right there. Just
or somebody's lying to you.
Full frontal disclosure. Oh, can you show that again?
This is official CIA interrogation and manipulation manual.
collective noun for what's the collective noun for disclosure? Let's see. An eyes wide shut of disclosures. It's a trench coat of disclosures.
Yes, everybody knows I'm not a disclosurist myself, personally. But,
Me either. Yeah, no, I'm sorry. I don't believe in the rapture.
No.
A disappoint of disclosures. That's kind of a flaccid of disclosures.
A comedy of disclosures.
Okay, so let's move on. Would you like to lead the discussion, Jeff?
Sure. Yeah, I can do that.
Right.
All right. So, yes.
Or do you want to use your slides, or do you want me to share them? Okay.
I'm going to go back to the slides are just like real quick. Then I go back to the document. So anyways, the first chapter we're talking about, and this chapter begins the section, the psychological section of the book, Reliability of UFO Witness Testimony. And I wish I knew a bit more about who Thomas D. Albright was, but he wrote this chapter, and it's called On Eyewitness Reports of Extraterrestrial Life. And I'll just read the abstract here of the chapter. A substantial majority of the American population today believes in the existence of extraterrestrial life. Despite the strength and persuasiveness of this belief, direct scientific evidence in support of it is limited. The primary reason for this limited support is that the evidence comes predominantly in the form of testimonial reports from eyewitnesses. Modern scientific understanding of human sensation, perception, and memory has revealed a host of factors that routinely undermine the validity of eyewitness reports under conditions of uncertainty. Recognizing this, the American criminal justice system has implemented new science-based reforms to reduce the likelihood of misidentification in criminal investigation and prosecution. This approach stands as a model for reform of the highly unregulated populist education of eyewitness reports of extraterrestrial life. Reform that could bring credible evidence to bear on a topic of great importance in matters of safety, security, and science adjudication. So basically, this paper is going to be suggesting, some of the kind of perceptual and other factors that go into eyewitness testimony, and some of the things they've done in the criminal justice system that perhaps could be applied to eyewitness testimonies of the extraterrestrial nature. So in this, he goes on to state that the vast majority of Americans kind of already are willing to believe that existence of extraterrestrial life, at least kind of like out there in the universe. And he says there are basically two forms of evidence for this kind of extraterrestrial life, and they kind of come down to either faith or kind of actual kind of physical evidence.
Yeah, and hence the thumbnail. But I also wanted to point out something. Is it all right if I interject while you're talking?
Yeah, absolutely.
That he doesn't really distinguish between extraterrestrial life and the extraterrestrial hypothesis. So just something I wanted to point out. So I think what he means implicitly is actually the extraterrestrial hypothesis, that there is extraterrestrial life visiting and interacting with humans on Earth, basically, and not simply the existence of extraterrestrial life, which I think is sometimes a distinction that people that are less engaged in this kind of topic don't make.
Yeah, I think that's true in the general sense. Like is specifically ends up applying it to our people's reported accounts of mostly like humanoid or like close encounter type of situation. People that believe they have had encounters with extraterrestrials is what he ultimately gets into. But yeah, he, as far as like at the beginning here, where he talks about like the American population believes in extraterrestrial life, that, for example, is not, that does not mean they believe extraterrestrial life is visiting us. I believe it's just they believe there's extraterrestrial life out there in general.
Yeah, which I think is actually a reasonable conclusion to come to, right?
Yeah. I mean, I believe there's most likely extraterrestrial life out there, and he kind of gets into like the various reasons why people believe this. And so let's see. So yeah, he doesn't actually have any experience with like these extraterrestrial encounters, but he does have considerable experience with a criminal case, and uh, he points out that, let's see, I have no experience. Anyways, there's these limits, that kind of affect our perceptual experiences. So he goes down to these two forms of evidence: faith and actual evidence. And many people's belief kind of comes down to a matter of just kind of faith. And there's kind of just a enormous large body of evidence reason why people end up believing this stuff. Everything from the kind of literature they read, science fiction, comics, movies, television, entertainment, to even like their religious beliefs, may predispose them to belief in life in the universe. I know as growing up Mormon, we believe that life is a thing in the universe, like absolutely. So a lot of people believe this strictly based on kind of faith things. And he points out that really the belief in an alien life is kind of no more surprising than the belief, for example, of the virgin birth and resurrection of Jesus. So a lot of people, faith alone is in fact enough to believe that there's extraterrestrial life out there. But the more kind of scientific form of to kind of back this up would be evidence. What kind of evidence is there that kind of could make us believe that there's extraterrestrial life out there? And he says this kind of evidence falls into two kind of categories: indirect and direct evidence. And direct evidence kind of falls into the categories of the potentials kind of for extraterrestrial life. And again, this is the things we know that like, we know that there's habitable planets out there that we picked up that, have the same kind of criteria that Earth had when we developed life, like water, they're not too hot. They're in the Goldilocks zone, a certain place in the sun. So we know there's planets out there that are similar enough to Earth that it's likely that they should develop Earth as well. Other forms of kind of indirect evidence is
he also brought up an interesting point that I had not really been aware of before, which is that the main method that scientists use to discover exoplanets is basically the same technique that's been used for centuries, and it was used to actually discover the planet Mercury.
The transit method.
Yeah, the transit method, exactly. So what did I say? Did I?
What you just said is that one of the main methods that they used back then.
Oh, okay. I didn't describe it. Yeah, so the transit method, which is when an object moves in front of a star and occludes it, basically. And so in the way that astronomers do that today, they're basically just measuring dips in the brightness of the star. But it is in essence the same technique that's been used for centuries.
Yeah, I believe it was really the first kind of method to, like I said, to detect these exoplanets. Now they can do things like they look for wobbles and like and like the orbits of things, which would imply another gravitational body of some mass near it. So yeah, there's all sorts of methods that they use now. And this is kind of what he gets into with the more direct evidence that we have. And he talks about, so there's two general categories of direct evidence, and that's signals that we could observe that might be indicative of a remote extraterrestrial civilization. And these are things like your radio signals, like maybe somewhere out in space, some extraterrestrial civilization is picking up Hitler's Nazi broadcast that was first broadcast out into, the air just now, and we've seen that exact case in the movie Contact, for example. So that's one of the ways, these direct signals that would be indicative of a civilization. And the other form is kind of more what we get in ufology here, which is real-time observations of proximal animated beings and devices that are inferred to be extraterrestrial origin. So, of course, these are your humanoid encounters, your encounters that these people have with these supposed kind of extraterrestrials. And again, like I say, these not only is there these days, SETI originally was kind of meant to pick up signals that were kind of stray broadcasts or things that would indicate intelligence. Now we can look for other kind of things as well, like technosignatures that could indicate life or some sort of life on that planet. So, for example, like methane, production, or certain levels of different chemicals in the atmosphere, which we can see through spectrographic analysis of the atmospheres of these habitable planets that might indicate life is there. So there's other kind of forms and signals that we can kind of pick up beyond just these stray, perhaps, communication signals. And that's one of the ways that we can kind of figure this all out. But what's more relevant to ufology, obviously, is these kind of encounters at close ranges here, which we all know Jalen Hyatt kind of created this categorization system for close encounters, kind of ranging from C1 to C4. He kind of really addresses just two of them here. The first kind of encounters that we see that people typically sometimes claim to be alien or extraterrestrial origin are your simple just UFO sightings. Your close encounters, the first kind, where people supposedly see UFO objects, within such and such distance, from them. And of course, he gives some examples like the flare event, the Nimitz encounter, the gimbal cases, stuff of that nature. And many times these things are picked up on multiple sensors, but they still seem to kind of lack enough information to kind of come to any sort of kind of definitive kind of conclusion about what some of these sightings kind of really are. And something he does point out that I think is interesting here is though there, however, are cases in which human eyewitnesses report some sort of extraterrestrial phenomenon, but that is actually contradicted by other sensors. Now, those sensors could be like a person, or they could be, like a camera. In these cases, he uses the example of the miracle of the sun and Fatima, and how there was a large volume of people that supposedly saw this observation of this sun, kind of animated sun moving around in the sky. But despite that, there were no other human observations. None of the astronomical tracking observatories, for example, saw this happening at the same time period. So despite you having all these eyewitness testimonies, there were in effect sort of other sensors that people that were not picking up anything when this was supposedly happening. And you see this sometimes in abduction cases too, where one of the parties remembers the abduction, but say the husband that was right next to them does not know anything about it, cannot confirm or kind of corroborate this kind of event kind of happened.
Yeah. And I think one thing that I was thinking about when I read that was that it could be, and people have proposed this idea before that it was some sort of localized phenomenon. So, he's kind of seems to be assuming that if the witnesses saw something, then it was actually something that had to have been going on that was visible all over the planet, but it could have been the result of some sort of atmospheric phenomenon or something. I mean, just talking about that one particular instance, not the entire extended episode. I tend to think that probably nothing actually happened, but there's a chance that it could have been the result of some sort of rare optical phenomenon caused by a freak thing going on with the weather or something like that.
Yeah. And perhaps the better example he uses is in the criminal cases here, where we regularly hear people like visually identify someone. Yes, that's him. I am certain. I will never forget the face. But in many of these cases, those people are later exonerated based on actual objective evidence like DNA. And there's been countless people wrongfully accused that have been based on eyewitness testimony that have later been, exonerated on hard, solid scientific evidence that proves they could not have done it. But then he gets into, he skips straight to the third kind here. And these are kind of our humanoid encounters. And this is, abundant, So yeah, like I said, these are our humanoid kind of encounters. He gives off of some examples from David Webb's 1973 humanoid case bake, because 1973 was a huge humanoid kind of flap. But these are basically encounters of direct eyewitness reports of extraterrestrial life with some sort of like live animated kind of being. And he compares these again to a lot of the kind of testimonies in like the cases of Fatima, and he compares them to Marian apparitions, and says that, there's a lot of kind of similarities here as far as kind of like eyewitness testimony. And in fact, many people have compared Marian apparitions and said they're related to the UFO phenomenon. This is in fact why I've actually done posts on like Fatima and the Miracle of the Sun as part of my daily history post, because many people have tried to tie these events and perhaps say that they're not as necessary as religious. Perhaps they're actually extraterrestrial kind of in nature. And he uses these kind of Marian apparition examples kind of a lot here, and how I guess the church basically, in this case, in the case of like Fatima and like the Miracle of the Sun, the Catholic Church basically officially kind of deemed these eyewitness testimonies as sort of true and worthy of belief, and kind of and in fact, some of the witnesses were actually canonized several years ago on the anniversary. And so here we have a very major institution kind of declaring their belief in eyewitness testimony as actually being kind of factual.
And I think that it's really useful to do here to compare, to draw comparisons between Marian apparitions and close encounters with UFO entities, because they are really, really similar in a lot of ways. The main differences are, kind of this, the cultural significance and the sort of
attribution
narrative meaning.
Yeah, kind of how they attribute things, like, and who knows, if those same people had a similar experience today, they might not have termed it in the terms of a Marian apparition. It might have been a UFO sighting. And so I just want to read this section here. This kind of his thesis here is, why do people report close encounters? His larger thesis is that the modern scientific understanding of sensory and mnemonic factors are known to influence the validity of eyewitness testimony in criminal cases also provides a foundation for interpreting eyewitness reports of UFOs and animated extraterrestrials. In particular, this science offers an understanding of why people report such things, regardless of whether we actually believe that they are true. This why question concerns not simply the causal factors that lead to the experience, but also the witness's motivation to end up reporting it. And he goes through kind of some of the reasons kind of why people might kind of report these things. Of course, there are the liars and the hoaxers and the frauds and deliberate fabrications. But as I mentioned, these are actually kind of quite rare in the literature. Most people are sincerely reporting what they at least kind of like believe that happens. He kind of talks a bit about Hynek and contactees, and how contactees with the kind of, and I've pointed this out before too, kind of my opinion, one of the main differences between I consider abductions sort of subcategory of contactees, almost. Like contactees just have a more kind of the person seems more special. It's a favored human intermediary, and many times it's almost like voluntary, right? Like like they were met and contacted, and they came in. It was all friendly. It's basically an abduction without the non-consent, essentially, kind of in my view. But one of the, as Heine points out, one of the main kind of things that characterized contactee cases was this idea that the kind of witness felt special, like they were chosen to be the point of contact from these kind of extraterrestrial beings. And you do kind of also see this in UFO encounters and in abduction cases where people feel like they were chosen to be abducted for whatever reason. And a lot of people so the UFO community dismissed contactee cases, for a long time. They felt it kind of brought ridicule on the topic, and it kind of did. But he then kind of goes on to explain, but what about after we get rid of like the liars, the hoaxers, and the social? My mouse is dead. Sorry. Turn new button.
Oh my God, you made like a pet mouse or something. I was like, oh no.
My battery died. So after we get rid of all the liars, the sociopaths, and the hoaxers, kind of what makes a credible witness. And he says that for kind of these other witnesses, the experience comes upon these extraterrestrial reporters just as unexpectedly and surprises them. These reporters are in no way special. They are not religious fanatics. They are more apt to be policemen, businessmen, school teachers, and other respectable citizens. Almost invariably, the UFO involvement is a one-time experience. And we've seen this in many of the kind of close encounter cases I've done presentations on, is where a lot of the times these people, they're normal people. They're the cops, the businessmen and school teachers. They're not like the religious fanatics, like in perhaps the cases of Fatima or the Miracle of the Sun. They're just normal people that it's kind of many times just a one and done experience, and that's that. So he then mostly just goes on to kind of relate some of his experience studying criminal cases. And he says that on surface, the problem appears to be the same. Can witness reports of a lived experience provide valid information for actions by others? So can we take what they said as valid and, further research it and, do something with that information? And he gives a lot of these kind of criminal kind of examples here. But he basically says in the end here, though, testimony consists solely of testimony consists solely of recalled memories, not recognition or identification. So when people are giving testimony, they're really just recalling memories. There's no way to really assess the validity of what they're reporting. It's not any kind of way to recognize or actually identify someone. He used the example of like the lineup. Yeah, somebody say.
The main problem with this is that the report can't be corroborated. So for example, if you observed someone, then you might be able to corroborate that by later being able to identify the person's face or their description or something like that.
Yeah.
But with an entity that comes out of a spacecraft, you can't really do that, basically.
Yeah. And this is something that I've just recently talked about on Twitter. I'm talking about so-called credible witnesses. So the thing with the so-called credible witnesses, like at best, that tells you that person is sincerely reporting what they're saying. So even when you believe a person is credible, there's no way to actually assess the validity of what was reported by that person. Credibility is pretty much a subjective judgment that you're giving someone based on various criteria, but that says nothing as to what they're actually reported and as to whether or not what they are reporting is valid and happened in the way they said they did. All it says is that, you know, you believe the person to be being truthful with you when they're reporting their lived experience. And he believes that knowledge that we've gained from how our vision and memory provide will help us provide insight into this collective belief of extraterrestrial life and visitation. And he talks about again, and this is something we've talked about in other episodes, the constructive nature of perception. You know, many people have this kind of false idea that I know what I saw, and because of that, they put the same kind of confidence in eyewitness reports that other people have reported. Because if you know what you saw, then surely that person knows what they saw too. And I've seen this a lot in the UFO community where I've literally been told by people that you can't research UFOs. The only way to really know anything about this topic is to know it yourself, to have experienced it yourself. Until you've had that lived experience, then you can't know anything about the UFO topic. But, you know, that's not really true at all.
And this is something that is talked a lot about in the next chapter as well.
Yep, exactly. And he points out that perception, by its very nature and for very good reason, is not an accurate reproduction of the world around us, but rather a construction of what we predict it to be. And again, this goes into this false idea that people have, that people kind of record memories kind of like it's a videotape, like, and that your memories are a recording of what your sensory input was that you saw. And this is just not an accurate representation at all of what's actually kind of going on here. In fact, he says there's actually an infinite set of real world environments that can give rise to any specific retinal image that you see. And then what you see, your sensory input, is only one aspect of how you perceive the world and how your memories kind of develop. There are a lot of other factors here that come into play for our perceptions, our uncertainty, our various biases, how confident we are about what we believe we saw. Our brain tends to kind of take these things and then fill in the gaps. It uncovers the problems with uncertainty by enriching sensations, by referencing prior knowledge and experience. So what we perceive and experience in our memories is more than just a collection of sensory inputs. It's also our prior lived experiences, our prior knowledge and concepts that we can mine to try to explain things and to put meaning into things when we have these lack of gaps of knowledge. And to illustrate this, he uses, I'm going to switch over to a slide I put up here. To illustrate this, he uses this example, and some people may have seen this before or seen similar images like this on Twitter. So in this image, it might initially appear to some people to be kind of random with no clear representation of what's in the image. I personally don't know that's true. I think the vast majority of the world already has enough cultural kind of influences and experiences of this figure to kind of grasp what we're seeing here. But
well,
to
I wouldn't be
maybe
so
not
quick to say that, because you know, the first time I looked at this image, I did not know, you know, when I was reading the chapter, I did not know what I was looking at. So I wouldn't be surprised if there were people watching the show who look at the image and they just see a bunch of random blobs, because that's what I saw initially when I first looked at this image.
Okay, yeah, I mean that's maybe true. So it's an illustrative example of kind of how our perception changes after we have additional information or that kind of can come into play here. So once we see the second image of what it really is here, you can clearly see this is basically a kind of a Jesus-like figure kind of here in a robe. Without all that extra noise, you can kind of see what's going on here.
Yeah, no, so go back to the
Now when you go back,
yeah,
I think now that you've actually, if you did not know what this was already, now that you've seen that second image, you can't go back to this and not see what you're seeing, right? Like now your brain has that extra information in there, and it's got that pattern that it can compare to. And our visual brain is literally a pattern finding machine, and we can go back and now we see it.
It's interesting. Rich said that he saw a face immediately. When I initially looked at the image, I saw a face too, but I didn't see the face that is significant here. I saw, if you look to the sort of go back to the other image, if you look to the left side, sort of on the figure's shoulder there, you see those three dots there? That's where I saw the face. I saw a little demon creature with kind of these. You see what I'm talking about?
Well, Gideon Reed said he saw Jesus holding a tridactyl alien mummy over his shoulder. So yeah,
I think that is kind of similar.
So yeah, it's interesting, and you kind of flip back and forth between these. But the point is that
Gideon Reed is really great, by the way. We've mentioned him on the show. He's also visited in the chat once or twice, and his work is really good. So I suggest everyone check it out.
Yeah. And so there's a quote here by William James that says, "While part of what we perceive comes through our senses from the object before us, another part, and it may be the larger part, always comes from our own head." And so the point of this example was to kind of illustrate how we perceive how we integrate other knowledge into our perceptual process. And you see a lot of these kind of examples. I posted several of them kind of on Twitter over the last couple of years as well, of things where once you've actually seen what you're supposed to be seeing, you can't unsee it. But there actually are illusions that don't work that way. There's illusions that you can forget, and unsee. But yeah, I find them kind of very, very, very interesting. And he goes on to point out that the same neurons that receive input in your brain from your kind of your visual system also receive input from another section of your brain, and that's your repository of visual memories gained from past prior experiences. And and this is shown kind of plotted out on this diagram here that shows, again, kind of how these pyramidal neurons that in our visual cortex that get not just our retinal stimulus, but they also get things from our visual memory, and that relates to our perception, and is plotted on a kind of a spectrum here between pure stimulus and pure imagery. And our perception is kind of tends to be a segment of kind of both of them. And he talks about on the far side of this pure imagery would be somebody that is living in an entirely kind of a hallucinatory world. Like maybe you've taken a massive dose of dimethyltryptamine and you're just off in hyperspace somewhere. Your entire experience would be purely hallucinatory, which may be terrifying. Probably would be terrifying to many people. For some people, it may be fun, at least on a temporary basis. On the other hand, you have what would just be pure stimulus. People that and perhaps I'm not an expert. Perhaps maybe this is people that have overstimulation issues, is where they're getting too much stimulus and it's just kind of overloading. But most people, it's kind of you're on a spectrum kind of between the two there, where you're getting stimulus and that's also dealing with stuff pulling from your visual memory and prior experience, and that's how you perceive. So anybody that thinks that what your perception is directly what you're seeing in the real world, it's not. It really isn't. And part of that,
and this is, I just wanted to say, this is really the meat of the chapter right here, is this principle that basically, the way that your perception works, it never does things without trying to provide a context based on probabilities of prior experience. Basically, if you just have visual information without any kind of interpretation for it, your brain's just not interpreting it, then you're not going to just have, it's not going to make any sense. You'll be stuck at that end of the spectrum on the upper panel there, where it's just pure stimulus, and that's just how our perception works.
Yeah. And he points out one of the kind of the problems with this kind of pattern recognition system of ours is sometimes there's some hazards with it, and sometimes our biases get what we perceive to be wrong, right? So there's kind of like an evolutionary benefit for being able to like notice a shadow at night might be a tiger that's gonna like kill you and be able to recognize that figure. And so your brain, you know, is primed to like see those patterns, but sometimes it gets it wrong. And but usually, as far as like a risk system, like it's better to get something like that wrong uh than to you know, not get it right. So you're better off, you know, getting the fact that that's not a tiger over there in the shadows wrong, you know, 100 times than missing it once and it is a tiger and it kills you. And so we're kind of like predisposed to kind of do this kind of thing. And it's in fact what magicians actually take advantage of in their kind of their magic acts here. Magicians, you know, kind of, and you point out, routinely manipulate this uncertainty and a bias that we have with our perceptions to kind of trick us into believing that we're seeing things that we're not. And he says, to make matters worse, perceptual inaccuracy born from uncertainty and biases is often associated with misplaced confidence. He points out, like when doing these criminal lineups, people's confidence seems to grow with reinforcement. So many times they may be uncertain, in fact, that that is the actual person at that time upon their first kind of like matchup. But but because of additional kind of corroborating information, like maybe the police say, oh well, then we found this, or that person, yeah, that person has a prior history doing this, and they hear all this other information and their confidence seems to grow in their initial kind of identification and kind of like a lineup. And this kind of increase in confidence was called by Daniel Kahneman illusion of validity. Which he says subjective confidence in a judgment is not a reasoned evaluation of the probability that this judgment is correct. Confidence is a feeling which reflects the coherence of the information and the cognitive ease of processing it. Declarations of high confidence mainly tell you that an individual has constructed a coherent story in his mind, not necessarily that the story is true. And I think that's very, very valid, a valid point that, you know, people confidence is really subjective. And this is why when we've talked about UFO stories before and how they kind of get honed and changed over time from the Jenny Randall's talked about kind of the different steps of like the UFO reporting process, where the people first see something and then what they report isn't going to be directly what they see. That's kind of after they process it a bit and report it to someone. And these things change kind of over time. And we see how people, even UFO witnesses, their stories, they start to make little changes to make their stories more coherent, because your story is not going to be spread and shared if it's incoherent and doesn't make any sense, if it hasn't been put together in a cohesive narrative that fits in with kind of also what people are already expecting in the community. And so you see witnesses kind of change their perspective, even on their own sightings, as they process information that they're getting from the outside. And a lot of times it's subconscious. They don't mean to do it. That's the other thing I think is important to point out, is that most of the times people aren't intentionally being deceitful. This is just how your brain works. This is just how your memory works. This happens with most people, unless you can keep an eye out for it and really like know what to look for. You can miss these kind of things. He then just kind of what goes into what's wrong with reporting close encounters. And again, it's kind of he points out again with criminal investigations, you know, eyewitnesses initially express a lack of confidence, but this uncertainty, because of things like uncertainty, emotions like terror or bad lightning, and biases come into play about physical appearances of character and the intent of the perpetrator. Yet eyewitnesses tend to ultimately become resolute because they have inferred cooperation that enables them to tell a coherent story. But he points out the problem we have with, you know, most eyewitness accounts, whether they be criminals or ET or Marian visitations, is that we really have no access to the ground truth, right? All we have is their perceptual reports that are going to be subject to their cognitive interpretations and limited by things like uncertainty, bias, and overconfidence. We can't, and again, there's something we talk about UFO sightings all the time, is we can't analyze the UFO. We can only analyze the sighting, which is a report. We can analyze and investigate what's reported to us, not the actual per se event itself. We have no real way to kind of scientifically test for the validity of these kind of witness testimonies or statements. But the problem is that while there's been upgrades in the criminal justice system that have been making a lot of changes to what's accepted as eyewitness testimony and taking a more critical approach to it, there's no such agreed upon standards for kind of witness debriefing and investigation techniques or interviewing techniques in the UFO community. And there really should be. And because of the rapid spread via the internet of such things as just uncontextualized stories, photographs, video feeds, it feeds a fervent base of UFO enthusiasts rather than an adjectived body of experts whose poorly informed proclamations about the existence of alien life without questioning the measurement conditions under which the evidence was obtained. He said, simply put, reports of extraterrestrial sightings are fuel for an unregulated and highly impressionable system that is more in common with Hollywood celebrity sightings than with the legal and scientific standards that modern criminal eyewitness testimony now aspires to. As much as the people believe in extraterrestrial life, and surely they will continue to do so, testimonial reports of extraterrestrial sightings will continue to elicit scientific skepticism and more likely the opprobrium and ridicule that Hynek bemoaned, unless the community of ufologists recognizes the inherent biological causes for human error and adopts a scientific approach to mitigate them. And I think that basically kind of sums up what his argument here is, that he's kind of pushing that, you know, we apply some of this same kind of knowledge that we've gathered about eyewitness testimony in recent decades that are now being applied to the criminal justice system and criminal and eyewitness testimony in those cases, that we should apply those same kind of standards of evidence and investigations to investigating close encounter sightings and UFO sightings. And there just isn't, as people like Jack Brewer regularly bemoan, you know, there's just a complete lack of agreed upon standards of evidence in this community and how to approach these things. And this is why I really like this book, you know, and these chapters in general, is because it's really trying to educate people about some of the issues with witness testimony that much of the UFO community just flat out ignores and acts like it's a non-issue. Like they say, they treat this more like, you know, celebrity sightings and entertainment, uncritically passing on stuff without proper investigation. And we do need better kind of standards of evidence. Do you have anything else to comment on that, Rachel?
Yes. So a couple of things. I forgot to mention at the beginning that this is, or that we forgot to mention, I guess, that this is the first chapter in the second part of the book. So far in the Ufos book club, what we've been covering was the first part, which was all just case studies. So every chapter was dealing with different specific cases of UFO sightings or reports of contact with extraterrestrials and that sort of thing. Now we're in the second part of the book, which is all about the psychology of UFO reports.
Yep.
And another thing to just mention is this is Thomas Albright here. He has a PhD in, I believe, neuroscience. He's a neuroscientist who basically specializes in the psychology of witness reports in regards to like criminal cases and stuff like that, but specifically like the neurobiology behind it.
Do you have something else?
Were you going to say something else about this chapter?
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to read this last part real quick because I think it's really relevant here.
Okay.
So that, and he was talking about again how kind of we these days kind of claim everyone's an expert, when we need kind of real actual expertise. But he says here that eyewitness is an exemplar of unqualified expertise. The witness is, by definition, holder of a specific type of information gained through experience. For that reason, they are viewed as singular experts in what they saw and remembered. But because the typical eyewitness has little idea about the operations, aptitudes, and frailties of biological systems for seeing and remembering, they are in no position to judge the validity of their accounts. Many eyewitnesses implicitly recognize this and appropriately qualify their testimony, as did the child witnesses of the Marian apparitions in Fatima. But the rest of us, equally naive about human biology, beseech them for certainty, and for our efforts end up with testaments of miracles or heinous crimes proffered by people who perceive something, but in reality have little idea what actually transpired. The solution to this, both in criminal and extraterrestrial cases, is to seek counsel from actual experts who understand how perception and memory work and how people make decisions based on their experiences. And this is, again, I've always said that some of the real experts we need in this field, more in this field, are experts in the human vision system, perceptual and memory factors, cognitive biases. These are some of the experts that I think we really need in this topic that have been lacking. Next chapter.
Before moving on, I just wanted to mention in regards to our one of our previous Ufos chats, I was talking about this book, and it was when I was looking at the representation of women in reliability, and it's worth pointing out that in fact Thomas D. Albright, his name is it's not mentioned that he's a doctor actually, so
cool.
Yeah. So which is like what you were saying, supports your criticism. Also, another thing is I wanted to show this website, which is kind of cool. This is Jorge Conesa Sevilla. He is, let's see here. If we go down to the bottom, it gives a little bio of who he is. He also has a PhD. So in biology, philosophy, and psychology from Humboldt State University in Arcata, California, or Arcata. I'm not sure how that's pronounced. This is his art, I believe. This is like shamanic art that he made.
That's cool.
Yeah.
I've got a bunch of shamanic art books, actually. I wonder if he's in any of them.
Yeah, I don't know. But he seems like an interesting guy. And as we'll see, he has a pretty distinctive writing style as well. His voice really shines through in this chapter. Has a very different feel to it from the other readings from this book that we've done so far. All right, go ahead, Jeff.
All right, so this chapter, Close Encounters of the Other Kind on the Psychology of Alien Abductions by Jorge Conesa Sevilla. And it starts out with a quote here by Jacques Lacan. The subject is nothing other than what slides in a chain of signifiers, whether he knows which signifier he is the effect of or not. And he kind of goes into that more later. So the abstract here. So even with the vast affiliation area that is meant by professional psychologists, diverse perspectives on what constitutes truth are found in reference to a willingness to accept at face value the phenomenological reality of the client. This sympathetic and sometimes necessary approach may at times obscure the complexities of the human mind, its capacity for creative confabulation on both sides. That is, it is assumed that a number of professional psychologists pursue the degrees and finish their training holding on to preferred biases, anti-science, pro-spirit, pro-UFO. Thus, a closer examination of what these interactions might be about and the role in prolonging a narrative of alien otherness might elucidate these processes from an evidence-based perspective. Not all abduction accounts can be explained. However, some may contain enough evidential irregularities to suggesting explainable mechanisms. So again, he starts off again by saying it'd be too simplistic to kind of throw all kind of experiences under one theoretical or empirical umbrella. Even in kind of UFO sightings, not all UFO sightings are the same. Somebody that sees a UFO sighting at day is different than somebody who sees one at night, is different than someone that claims to see an alien in person. So there's a lot of different yes, I just lost my train of thought. Different kind of sightings to kind of and experiences that may in fact have different kind of explanations and processes kind of behind them. He says, making the claim about the veracity of one of the above situations, such as several people saw in daylight an unusual looking sphere and videotaped it, and afterwards extrapolating these facts to imagine alien visitations and other purported UFO lore is a bad inference. He talks about kind of Lacanian, the idea of signifiers and signification here. Signification is a never-ending chain of meaning, motive, central, and peripheral that are necessary for framing our realities, individual and collective. I don't know. Do people know what that means? Do people know what signifiers and signified and Lacanian signal? Did people know what that means? Do you know what that means, Rachel?
I don't know exactly, but I think that what he's kind of saying is that basically that signification, Lacanian signification basically has it that the meaning of something is created in the relationship to other signifieds, basically, and so everything that that we experience happens in this kind of sequence of meaning. So everything exists in context, and it actually, this chapter, while very different from the previous chapter, in many ways dovetails with it in a lot of different ways, because again, what he's saying, just like in the last chapter, how our perception depends upon our brain interpreting sensory inputs using past experience. Here, what the author is saying, I'm sorry, what is his name again? It's Conessa Sevilla.
Yeah.
Is that basically the way that we experience things is always contextualized through meaning making, basically. So it's not exactly the same thing, because he's not talking specifically about perception. He's more talking about like the signification of our experience, but it's very similar in a lot of ways, because it's, our mind interprets the experiences that we have on the basis of previous experiences that we had and the meanings that we associated with them in the past, as well as other, meanings that we pulled from things like stories and stuff like that. If that makes sense. Sorry if someone protests my explanation, please let me know.
Yeah, I pretty much had to go back and review, since it's been a little while since I've kind of read about this stuff, and it pretty much what Rachel says, it goes back to Saussurian linguistics, where the idea of like the signifier was like the sound of like a word, or like the word, for example, and the signified was the concept or meaning of the signifier. But he kind of expands that out into just more, I guess, a general relationship to kind of meaning in general. Like you said, he talks about the chain of signifiers, and to him, this is how basically each signifier kind of only gains meaning in relation to the other kind of signifiers, so the other context. And so, for an example, would be like the word love. The word love kind of really has a kind of fundamental incompleteness. It lacks kind of meaning without context, because it means different things for different kind of people, right? Just my mind. Right. So, so for example, when you add other words in, such as like devotion or like passion or whatever, then you can perhaps get a better meaning of what the word love means. Because love can mean romantic love. Like I can say I love like a wife, or love, you can love a friend, or you could love, I love this book. Like it means different things without that extra context, right? And so like all those extra signifiers is helps kind of come up with your context, and each individual kind of brings their own kind of associations with these words. Like what love means to me might not mean the same thing as what love means to somebody else that perhaps grew up in like a traumatic family circumstance or whatever. And so we each kind of bring our own associations with these terms, kind of that are relate also to our prior experiences and unconscious experiences, to create kind of meaning for when we say things. But it's never really stable. It really depends on the other context that come into the situation.
Yeah, and just to provide a little bit of going back to the beginning of your explanation, he was saying not what Jeff said there was not Saussurean, but Saussurean, based on the ideas of Ferdinand de Saussure, who's a semiotician who Lacan was sort of building off of in his work. And Saussure came up with this idea of the signified and the signifier. So basically I don't remember exactly how it works, but I believe it's that the signifier is like, say, a painting, right? And then the signified is like the subject of the painting. So if you have like, say, a coin or something, that coin you might use to represent your lost loved one or something like that. And so the coin in that instance would be the signifier, and the lost loved one would be the signified. And so Lacan is basically saying, I believe, and because I haven't reviewed this stuff in a long time either, but basically that we kind of exist in this network of signification, and so
the semiotic space,
where
the signs and meanings interact, overlap, and shape each other.
Yeah, and so nothing basically, like, meaning doesn't exist without context, but really kind of exists in a sort of meaning space. And
it's the signifier, dynamic, context-dependent unit of meaning that's part of a shifting network of associations. So
anyway, continue.
So then he just kind of jumps into kind of talking about our predisposition for nocturnal affect vulnerability. He does make a point here, though, I think is very important. He says, whether part of clinical or empirical work, little is gained and some harm could be done by accepting unqualified the subjective report of an obviously frightened individual that extraterrestrials or government agents are the primary cause, or of a set of experiences that might otherwise be explained. And Occam's approach to sifting through explanations, although not foolproof, might be a better protocol evaluating the uncanny experience. And I agree with that personally. Like I think there's a bit too much of accepting people's experiences as truthful, particularly when it comes to mental health professionals that are inside the UFO community. I think they tend to jump to accepting these experiences as being valid and a true representation of what happened, when I think that's kind of a bad approach, personally. I say this chapter is it's really good, but it's almost
it's very, the thing is that it's very dense and it's very difficult to work through. So just to go back for a second to this the previous paragraph where he's talking about the predisposition towards nocturnal affect vulnerability. So what he's talking about is that correct me if I'm wrong. Tim Brigham might be helpful here, but I think what he's talking about is that when people are sleeping, they are vulnerable to certain types of affective states, basically, which he's going to go into more in the next section, where he talks about sleep paralysis a little bit. But yeah, this is a really dense chapter, because I think what he's doing is he's pulling from not only different types of discourse really rapidly. But he's doing it. He's not really going into detail about every single thing that he's talking about, and he's just kind of trying to display his own sort of model that's based on a lot of different sources of information. So it can be difficult to follow.
Yeah. So like you say, he was talking about in relation to how these experiences, such as like potential medical examination by aliens, had to be taken into consideration of these predispositions towards nocturnal affect vulnerability. So he talks about the percentage of the population has what's called isolated sleep paralysis, to name a variety of other kind of factors that could kind of relate to this. And he then goes on to talk about the isolated sleep paralysis and false memories.
So yeah, what he's kind of saying is that we basically, like, the sleep paralysis experience is something that's universal, and that we're kind of a certain chunk of the population is predisposed to. Yeah. So it doesn't really make sense to immediately jump to this hyper contextualized interpretation involving aliens and abduction and stuff like that.
Yeah. And he focuses heavily on this sleep paralysis stuff, because I guess that's part of his area of expertise, is that he's extensively studied people that have had these sleep paralysis experiences. He goes on to talk about isolated sleep paralysis, which apparently is different than normal sleep paralysis. He gets into that a bit later. How commonly one of the feelings is a feeling of presence, or FOP. I've had sleep paralysis. Many times people talk about sleep paralysis, they talk about the old Hague effect. They feel like there's like somebody sitting on their chest, or they feel like there's some sort of like malevolent entity kind of at their foot, the foot of their bed, or they feel like there's some sort of presence there, which is very similar to people that say feel like they were abducted from aliens from their bedroom. They felt like there was an alien in their bedroom and they abducted them.
Yeah, and the sense of presence, or what he's calling here the feeling of presence, I've often seen it described as a sense of presence. So he might be describing something slightly different, or he's just using a different vocabulary. But basically, it's a type of hallucination, basically, or it can be treated as such, that instead of having some sort of sense modality giving you a signal that there is another entity there, it's just a direct sensation of there being an entity there. So you don't see an entity, you don't hear an entity, you don't feel like a creature touching you or anything like that. You just sense a presence. Just like if you're watching a scary movie at night alone and you feel as if there's someone behind you watching you, that's a sense of presence. It's a very common experience.
Yeah, for me, it was always I didn't really see anything. I just felt it would feel like there was some evil in the room or something, like there was some evil presence in the room, I've experienced sleep paralysis probably hundreds of times. So I've got quite a bit of experience with this, and extremely vivid lucid dreamings, which we'll talk about a bit more later. And yeah, I've absolutely felt like kind of a feeling of terror. Like I felt like there was an evil presence, but I couldn't really see it or anything. It was just like I felt like there was something in the room, and it felt negative to me.
And I've had sleep paralysis a number of times, not as many times as you have, it sounds like, but I don't usually get any sort of presence with my sleep paralysis, though, which is interesting. Like I might experience terror, but no like entities.
Not always, though.
Most of the time, not like sense of presence anyway. I have had like experiences where I thought that, I had this experience that someone walked into my apartment, like I could hear their footsteps, and they went into the bathroom, and that happened to me multiple times. So, but that wasn't, I wouldn't call that a feeling of presence, though.
Oh yeah, I've had non-terrifying experiences like that, like where again it's like I'd be in my room, and what I probably heard was like my brother or something walking down the hall and talking, like where I've kind of then integrated these things kind of into my memory. Like I remember once where I woke up and I thought we were cooking fish and we had just gone fishing, but I guess I was kind of just in that kind of state where I was kind of like in sleep paralysis and not quite awake yet. And it was just my brother, I guess, had been walked through the hallway and was talking to his friends about something. And I integrated that into my, memory of what I thought happened, in this kind of experience. And so it's not always terrifying, but a lot of times people have this sense of presence or feeling kind of like a presence.
Anyway.
One thing he said I thought was interesting is that when they trigger these kind of experiences in the laboratory, and they have studied things like the sleep paralysis and feeling of presence in the laboratory, apparently these people don't see ghosts or aliens, though, when they trigger this in the laboratory experience. So, but I mean, I think there's a lot when you're triggering something like in a laboratory experience. I mean, I think your environment might play a lot of role into even just your sleeping environment, like into what kind of experiences you might have in these kind of situations. It's kind of like when I've done so many sleep studies, just like normal sleep studies and the problem is one of the reasons why they started to do them at home now with take-home devices is because trying to fall asleep in a cold clinical medical building is a bit different than your normal sleep experience at home. So I think factors like that could come into play, but I don't know. I haven't looked at the data, but it is interesting that they don't see aliens and ghosts when they've tried triggering them before. He does make a point out here about, he says that many unexperts kind of use uncritical language when they talk about sleep paralysis. That isn't helpful. And he gives this example. He says sleep paralysis is a common non-pathological sleep disorder. It occurs in the intermediate stage between sleep and full consciousness and can last anywhere from a few seconds up to several minutes. It is often characterized by symptoms such as auditory or visual hallucinations, immobility, a sense of presence, fear, or a feeling of pressure on the chest, or the feeling of floating. And he points out that there's a distinction between isolated sleep paralysis, which occurs in a neurotypical population without other symptoms, and sleep paralysis that occurs in narcolepsy. So maybe what I have isn't isolated sleep paralysis because I'm not technically narcoleptic, but I have severe sleeping disorders. I know there's a difference here. And he says the phrase above that they use, the intermediary stage between sleep and full consciousness, is a non-technical description that lacks medical precision, which might give rise to further ambiguity and misunderstandings. He points out that, paralysis is a normal part of all sleep.
That's a book that I read about this, which is a really important work, early work on sleep paralysis. Is The Terror That Comes in the Night by David Hufford. And this, I think that he actually talks about this point way back then. I mean, he doesn't talk about it specifically, but what there's a section of the book where he's attempting to basically describe the type of state that sleep paralysis occurs in, and it's much. I think that he's right. There's a lot of ambiguity that could easily come into play from this description because it's very vague.
Yeah. And he says that situations like this, where open-ended imagination and errors in describing sleep proper gets even more confusing when other so-called experts come to the assistance of abductees employing other questionable and unreliable techniques like hypnosis.
Yeah, this is why. Sorry, going back to because in this description it just says sleep paralysis. It doesn't say, what I try to call it is a sleep paralysis experience, right? Because you're actually experiencing being paralyzed when, in fact, it's normal for your body to become paralyzed and to experience muscle atonia when you go into sleep, when you go into REM sleep.
Yeah. You're just not usually self-aware of it. So sleep paralysis
Exactly.
is, everyone has sleep paralysis. It's just not everyone wakes up from it. That's an important distinction. And he points out, researchers like Elizabeth Loftus, who's a very good memory researcher. I've shared videos of hers multiple times, how she's looked at and kind of deconstructed a lot of the questionable work of people like Bud Hopkins and John Mack. And he says she's a good example of the kind of scientific rigor and critical thinking. Let's see. The questionable work of so
I just want to kind of point out here that it sort of bugs me that people do this thing where they say like his, her, or her, himself, like that. Just use they or them. It's been in use for decades now, and I don't understand why one would.
Well, typically when you don't know what they are, though.
Well, yeah, I know. Well, I mean, they is less is more. Her or himself basically assigns either male or female gender to the person being referred to. So just saying themself or themselves would be less descriptive, basically.
Sure.
Anyway, it's not really that relevant.
He just he then states that considering the fact that there's these potentially co-occurring factors like sleep paralysis, feeling of presence, our kind of evolutionary propensity to feel insecure at nighttime, perhaps a more evidence-based critical thinking approach to the alien abduction phenomenon is necessary. Evaluating statements about the veracity of something as disturbing and anxiety producing as an alien abduction or perceived injury is also reported, and while naming suspects requires the most sophisticated and up-to-date tools used in forensic discovery and the professional acumen to see these investigations through. He does kind of point out something that's interesting that other people have pointed out, like these are crimes, right? Somebody's allegedly being kidnapped from their bed. They're being violated with medical experiments. Yet, like nobody's reporting them to actual police or forensic experts. Like with this recent Bob Hodgkins documentary that came out, if the lady was being kidnapped, why didn't Bud report it to the police or the FBI? But and they actually talk about in the documentary. And it's because they don't want interference with their narrative building that they're doing with their, witnesses here, basically. Because, people like Bud Hopkins has no forensic or psychological training or really any skill set to be able to properly help these people or investigate these cases. He then just goes again into the various kind of states of consciousnesses that can affect alien abduction experiences. The richness of conscious experience while awake or asleep might contribute to misperceiving or misreporting of uncanny phenomenon. The naive public is often carried away by mostly impressionistic and emotion-landed explanations. I have a slide I put up here. he has a slide here for this kind of section on states of consciousness here, where he shows many experiences normally oversimplified as sleep can be described in reference to how these may feel like being awake. To many people, misreporting uncanny phenomenon that feels objectively real. Many times when people talk about these kind of experiences of sleep paralysis or lucid dreaming, they even report it as being more real than real. And so it's very, very real to them. And so this actually author had done a sleep study where they employed a 103 item questionnaire in order to kind of better ascertain the many dimensions of conscious states while you're asleep. And he kind of breaks these down into like three different kind of three categories here. The first is the degree to which a dream experience feels like the real world. And this is called cognitive embeddedness. The second is the degree to which the perceptual experience was exact, similar to or not at all like everyday awake consciousness. And that's called perceptual acuity. The third is the degree to which the subjects were able to function in their dream realities as they might normally in their everyday life. And this is called their functional control of their dream states here. So for a subject that reports, it doesn't feel like a dream at all because they interacted in it just like it was kind of the real world, would kind of score highly kind of on this questionnaire. And the high score correlates with these vivid dreams, lucid dreaming, and these kind of sleep paralysis or feeling presence or out of body kind of like experiences. And I say, I personally, again, I've experienced this. I've experienced dreams, vivid dreams, lucid dreams that were so real that I literally thought I was somewhere else. Like I had full control. I was living my life. It seemed 100% real. In fact, when I woke up, it did not seem like I was waking up. It seemed like I was on the other end of the world doing what I was doing. 1 second later, it's like I was teleported to my bed, and I'm like, what's going on here? I was just elsewhere. So these can seem very real, more real than real. And I personally experienced these dreams that were so real, I felt like I was teleported from one place to the next, and just instead of waking up. This does happen. He goes on to state that you could create one of these kind of cubes for kind of describing the phenomenology behind being a kind of awake as well. And states that given the ease which any person could be persuaded to accept a false memory or delude himself into thinking that aliens truly kidnapped him or her and assert these facts with a high degree of confidence, then it is clear that much in-depth psychological forensics must take place before we accept these reports at face value. Because even if these events seem very real, and we are to have we should have compassion and sympathize with these people, because these are real felt emotions. It's their real experience, even if it's not objectively real. However, to take this person at their word and to confuse their improbable stories about alien abduction as potentially being, objectively real seems misguided at best. And he says, cruel or exploitative at worst. He then goes on to talk about a couple of other things. He talks about imagination, inflation, the Dunning-Kruger effect, and pseudo-profound bullshit. He says that, again, most UFO reports that are in the lore can be broken down into two categories, public or private. So public events, obviously, where there's potentially multiple people that see something in the daytime, they could videotape it. And in cases like this, you could bring in experts, like video experts to potentially analyze the video, for example. And there's some sort of a kind of potential, I guess, objective kind of evidence or experts you could bring in to authenticate those kind of claims. But then you have the alien abduction experiences, and these, by their very nature, are private. These are experiences that occurred basically just to them, only them, and we kind of only really have their testimony about what they believe happened to them. So while we can't investigate those with like, video experts and whatnot, this is where it's important to consult, again, these experts, psychologists and other experts that can really look at witness testimony and kind of dig into this. Because he says, as to reiterate, the ease at which any of us can reconstruct an event falsely, naturally, and without an intent to deceive is evident in the work of Elizabeth Loftus and other researchers. And again, I pointed this out earlier, and I point out again, most people, they're not trying, there's no intentional desire to deceive people here. This is just how your brain works. So when you're not accepting, in the UFO community, there's this really big belief that you should just take everybody at their word and you should accept the testimony as fact because that's what they're telling you. And if you don't, you're somehow calling them a liar. You're saying they're, manipulating the, but that's not what you're doing. To not accept these as being, necessarily objectively real does not mean you're calling them a liar, because most people are not lying about this kind of stuff.
Yeah, I think something that I've thought, I think about this a lot, and I think what I would recommend, people to think about is, if you have a strange experience, you should be skeptical of the experience, because really, how do you know anything is real? I mean, I don't want to argue for solipsism or something like that, but I mean, there's good reason to be skeptical of pretty much any kind of experience that you have, because it's all just perceptions that are happening, in your awareness, basically. And I really like this quote though from Tedeschi that he's saying it's very psychoanalysts have long held that most of mental life is unconscious. So in other words, most of the stuff that and this is backed up by in other subfields of psychology as well. This isn't limited to psychoanalysis at all. Most psychologists agree that most of what happens in the mind is not going on in conscious experience at all, and is going on in the background.
Yeah.
And it's kind of, I wouldn't say that it is like this, but a sort of analogy is sort of like, your conscious mind is kind of like a puppet, or like a marionette, and your unconscious mind is pulling the strings a lot of the time.
Yeah. I say we should all doubt our experiences, because we're all subject to our biases and uncertainties and prior experiences and all sorts of other factors that come into play. He says something else I think is kind of really relevant here is, again, there's a persistent but false folk psychological belief that only the subject is qualified to gaze accurately by leaps of faith or intuition into the inner workings of his or her own psychology. A person who is justly terrified by these assaults but wants nothing to do with the critical thinking oriented psychologist may end up embracing the most cockamamie notion that could explain his or her experiences. Under these circumstances, they may fall victim to pseudo-profound scientific bullshit. In addition to the individual differences mentioned in Section 1, there might be psychological propensities in certain individuals to prefer unorthodox explanations or to be consistently credulous across several other domains. And you might argue that's where Betty Hill falls into, a propensity to prefer unorthodox explanations and to be credulous across various kind of domains there. And again, I think there's a lot of people in the community that just believe that only the witness is really truly able to look at what happened in their experience. No one else kind of can do that. They have this kind of privileged status as to the inner working of their mind. And that's just not, again, that's false. That's kind of like this folk psychological belief that kind of goes along with the I know what I saw kind of idea mindset. He talks about Dunning-Kruger again, and the sense of overconfidence makes them blind to the inability to judge their own, incompetence. He makes an interesting point about hypnosis here that I also thought was kind of interesting. He says, the practice of hypnosis, despite by its very own methodology and nature, requires a willingness to take on suggestion. And might it not be the appropriate method which to examine alien abduction claims? And I think he has a very valid point that the people that are like, not everyone is susceptible to hypnosis. Like they talk about people being suggested, like hypnosis is very nature means like you're suggestive and you're willing to take on suggestions. And so again, is that the best tool to analyze these stories when it's a tool that requires people to be susceptible in the first place? It goes on to again talk about how even professional psychologists, after finishing their training, still tend to hold on to kind of a lot of their preferred biases. So there are a lot of professional, like mental health professionals, that have been in the UFO topic for quite a while. It's just unfortunately a lot of them are true believers. They're all in on the abduction phenomenon. Like I've seen people that even were UFO people first and then went and got trained to be a therapist so they could, be an abduction researcher.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that this kind of plays into the this idea of being a caretaker of religion. Here, we're not talking about people studying religion, but people who are working as therapists can become basically the progenitors of their own belief system, and kind of proselytizing to their patients, I feel like.
Yeah, that's why I say it's important to also examine the motives, the professional motives of these other people, to kind of potentially elucidate their role in enabling the process of these alien abduction narratives. And I think you certainly see that with a lot of these like big researchers. Like if you listen to abduction hypnosis tapes by people like Bud Hopkins and John Mack, and like there's a clear like leading these people in the directions that they already believe in, like the narratives that they're already telling, right? Like so, like people like David Jacobs kind of puts everything under the lens of a threat, like so his abductees, it's a threat, a human hybrid program. I think Bud Hopkins kind of had a more positive, like kind of a narrative for the abductions. People were chosen, they're special, they're being given messages. Same thing with like kind of John Mack. Like all these researchers, you've got to look at them and what their motivations are as well, because they're going to bring that into the work they do in this community. And in many cases, I think that at the very least, it's unethical, if not criminal and exploitative, is what some of these abduction researchers have done. I would argue that at the very least, Hopkins, Jacobs, Mack, all those guys were at the very least extremely unethical, if not criminal, and exploitative in what they were doing. So. He says basically, again, we need to be compassionate, but always understand that the strangeness and intensity of the so-called alien abductions may drive experiencers to seek out equally uncanny explanations when the answer might be, if not simpler, at least within the purview of neuropsychiatry and neurobiology, sleep science. And I think you do see that a lot. You see a lot of people that really they only want a more sensational explanation. Like, somebody can tell you they suffered, this alien abduction. It can sound exactly like sleep paralysis, and you can tell them that, and they're like, no, it's not sleep paralysis. I met aliens. Like, there's a lot of people that are just willing to jump to these kind of more fantastical explanations and aren't really looking for a more mundane answer. But before we jump to these things like alien abductions, we need to better understand some things like sleep sciences and perceptual factors and other things that can come into play that could be creating these kind of experiences that people are reporting. In his conclusion, he says, no amount of philosophical conjecturing or try as you go impromptu kind of techniques can replace exacting scientific methodologies. So and that doesn't mean kind of all science goes. There's a lot of I think this gets into kind of what he was talking about, profound pseudoscientific bullshit. Is that a lot of the paranormal community kind of addresses things up in the terms of science and sciencey sounding stuff to kind of add credibility to things, but that doesn't mean they go together, right? Like he's an example, like quantum entanglement has been adapted to things like consciousness and spiritual to explain equally third absurd idea, spiritual evolution. And you get these videos like Spirit Science on YouTube and whatnot that, to some people sound sort of scientific, or even paranormal TV shows, that, some of our favorite paranormal shows that you get like on the History Channel, for example, they to the general audience, they may seem kind of scientific sounding and cool because they use fancy instruments. They're doing tests with scientific instruments. It sounds sciencey, but it's not. And so we need real exact scientific methodologies kind of like investigating this topic. Is there anything you wanted to add on that, Rachel?
No, I don't think so. I think, yeah, as we get further into this section of the book, it's probably going to get a little bit more hairy because, I think that he's right that that psychology is right. It is a science, so that means that it relies on empirical methods, basically collecting evidence in order to test hypotheses and thereby make inferences on that basis, and doing so, using rigorous methodologies, such as controlling for variables and using double blind studies and stuff like that. But there's also, psychology can get pretty hairy because sometimes it's difficult to tell when someone is being scientific or when they're using a psychological model that's not really scientifically based. And over the past 15 years, psychology has definitely had some issues because, in particular, of the replication crisis, where basically like a large number of psychological studies have failed to be replicated successfully. So I think we have to kind of take stuff with a grain of salt, even when it's coming from a scientific from the field of from scientific fields, especially scientific fields that fall under the larger domain of anthropology.
Yeah. Also, a couple other points I guess I wanted to mention here is that so he in his conclusion here is he again he talks about the dualities found in interpretations of like UFOs and alien visitation experiences, typically put in tropes like bad versus good, doom, transcendence, damnation versus salvation, and that this is psychologically important. Invoking Lacan again, he says the phenomenological subject is upon the dynamics of otherness, his own and that of others. This vast dynamic semiotic space is constantly shifting. So again, we go back to what we were talking about at the very beginning of the chapter, or that the semiotic space is, the space where all these kind of different ideas, the signs and the symbols, and it's an abstract conceptual area where these signs and meanings interact and overlap and help shape each other, where kind of language, symbols, cultural signs, and all forms of meaning making operate and intersect. He again briefly mentions how people kind of sort of even in abduction experiences start to feel special and kind of dismiss the negative things that are happening to them. So even though the experience may be negative, they're abducted and these medical examinations are performed on them, they because they start to still feel special, they feel that they're at the center of something grand, they dismiss these kind of negative experiences, much in the way that he gives an example in mythology, how many cases a virgin will be taken by a powerful god in order to bear his demigod children, kind of taken against her will, but because because her negative experience pales in comparison to the privilege of being chosen for such a momentous event, they kind of overlook it. And you see similar kind of things happening kind of in the UFO abduction kind of cases, where people, despite having terrifying experiences, seem to be glad that they were chosen. Let's see, says how the underfoot, however, a discover beneath all this, that perhaps not as alien, a discoverable synaptic malfunction, a missed sleep sequence, and a representation-prone brain confabulate and collate an uncanny narrative that satisfies cultural trends or ideas about extraterrestrials. Once free to roam in our imaginations, any combination of these narratives is as good as any other. Shamans and UFOs, gremlins and malfunctioning airplanes, Jesus and little green men, or reptilian civilizations presently and concurrently existing in an hollow earth. The average citizen, one dares to venture, lives unaware that his or her perception of the color red is an invention, that in fact all his or her experiences are brain representations, a virtual reality, that the naive and uneducated experiencer is not privy to the wet mechanics of his or her computational machine, the human brain, is understandable. That well-meaning but inept enablers add fodder to delusions is problematic, but still understandable if they are as naive as their own clients. That manipulative professionals knowingly take advantage of naive folks in order to be under an otherwise elusive spotlight is exploitative and could be considered criminal. Given the fact that given the scientific fact that human brains represent, infer, and make sense of the world as best as they can, it is prudent to seek answers within the dynamics of the cerebral circuits rather than far away and yonder in the stars. And I agree with that. We need a more critical approach. We need experts that are trained to look at this, that perhaps aren't taking these people's statements while still being compassionate and showing sympathy, aren't just blatantly accepting them as being objectively real. And we need experts that aren't the experts that we got. A lot of the mental health professionals, again, I see in the UFO community, are true blue abduction believers that are more on the exploitative side than on the helping side. And I think that's problematic and unfortunate.
I agree. Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it's difficult though, because kind of at the same time, an argument could be made that Western psychology, also has its own culture-bound concepts, and that's the thing about the human being, is that it's kind of slippery, and while yes, we can study psychology empirically, it can get pretty messy, when you're talking about stuff like this, because we all believe stuff, and we all exist in a semiotic space, of meaning making, and so I think that for that reason, it's really important to for people who are doing psychological research to be extremely rigorous in what they're attempting to do.
Yeah. And a lot of this, a point of this is there's a lot of, like you say, controversy about the psychotherapy community and the broader psychiatric community, and what's accepted, what's not accepted, and various ideas like that. I think it's important to point out, though, a lot of this research is more about neurobiology, though. It has to do with the psychology of what people experiences, but we can actually study, and peer-reviewed scientific studies and stuff. It's not subjective.
I mean, yeah, well, it attempts as much as possible to not be subjective, but that's the thing, is that depending on what sort of subfield of research in psychology one is doing, they are going to have to rely more or less on qualitative information, and so it's difficult. It's messy.
But at least with things like sleep paralysis, like say you can study that in the lab. How do you study an alien abduction in the lab, right? An alleged alien abduction in the lab? You can't. That's
Absolutely. Yeah.
the nature of these anomalies is that they're fleeting, and people have tried to do things like MUFON had a project to put a box in abductees' bedrooms, that would record ambient information to supposedly confirm, some real event to what was happening there. But really, there's just no way to really study an abduction in situ, as it happens, right?
Yeah, unless you're
Unless you're an alien.
unless you got Maureen Putty,
Yes,
someone like that.
Yes.
But yeah, I think because Maureen Putty, she was this
It's the car one, right?
yeah, where she actually had UFO investigators with her. I believe it was Anne Dressel.
Oh, yeah, she's the lady that had two sightings. She
Yeah,
had
and
one and then a later one, and the car. Yeah.
Yeah, and the second sighting, I believe, she actually had two people with her, and she was narrating what was happening to her as she was being abducted, basically. So she was kind of like abducted out of her body, I guess.
Oh yeah. There's people that say that abductions aren't physical, so that's how they explain. For example, like the husband next to them noticed nothing, because they weren't physically taken out of the bed. It was more like a astral abduction of some kind. So there are people that claim these abductions are psychic in nature. There's in fact, it's kind of like a whole niche field of ufology, the psychic theories of abductions and whatnot.
Yeah, and
Button has a book on that.
Something to point out about these sleep paralysis experiences, as well as a bunch of other types of, really weird experiences that overlap with high strangeness, or, depending on how you want to describe it, could even be classified as high strangeness, I suppose. Is sleep paralysis experiences were not identified by psychology until the 1970s, and or maybe, I guess, sort of like at the late 1970s, early 1980s, and the way that they were identified was by David Hufford. If I could be wrong about this, I don't know, but my understanding is that David Hufford basically identified the sleep paralysis experience, and what he did was he was able to figure out the epidemiology of this type of experience by, first he collected reports. He had his own experiences. He had his own sleep paralysis experiences, which were these kind of classic experiences involving entities and stuff like that. And so what he did was he started collecting reports from students, and then he collected them in Newfoundland, and then he collected them from another population in another part of Canada or something like that. And he was collecting reports from people that did not have a folk tradition, right? Who didn't have any knowledge of something like an old hag, or, of demons, that try to possess you when you're going to sleep, or anything like that. Yeah. And so he was able to figure out basically that this is an experience that happens pretty reliably, universally, among any population. So it's not a culture-bound thing. It does not arise out of culture. Instead, it arises out of something else. And in the decades since that time, there's been a lot of study into the biological mechanisms behind that. Like, and I think he was even talking about narcolepsy at that time and was saying, you know, that a lot of these experiences probably have to do with narcolepsy, and, you know, these sorts of things. People have been able to identify a lot of different biological causes behind these sleep paralysis experiences. But the thing that's interesting to me is that initially, you know, when this was first being investigated, it was an unexplained experience. You know, it was this very bizarre thing where, you know, and literally, like, you know, the reason why Hufford was investigating it was because there was no psychological description of it. I mean, there was descriptions, right? There were people's reports that existed in psychological literature, but psychologists again and again failed to identify this specific experience. They would confuse it with other things, and or describe it, you know, as other things, basically. So I think, you know, what that means is, to me, is, you know, you can actually study empirically these things that are unexplained, and they can oftentimes be preternatural stuff and not, you know, they're not unexplainable necessarily. I mean, you know, I'm sure that, you know, according to Heisenberg's uncertainty principle or whatever, and, you know, perhaps other like sort of rules like that, that yeah, there are things in nature that are unexplainable, in the sense that we cannot scientifically, you know, document and explain them, you know, but most stuff we can actually empirically study. If you can experience it, you know, and if it affects your behavior and it affects your body, you know, or if it just affects your mind, then it can be it can probably be empirically studied in some way.
Yep, sleep paralysis. This book I've been reading by Lewis Proud, his first book was on sleep paralysis, called Dark Intrusions. But
I might have that book, actually.
Like he points out, is that he was a little inexperienced, naive, and credulous when he first wrote it. At the time, he believed some sleep paralysis experiences might actually be from external entities and, you know, spirits or whatever. And in this book, he kind of says, well, he's more agnostic. He's open to the idea. He thinks, again, since he's done some more researches, most likely neurological or physiological factors at play with sleep paralysis that have nothing to do with external entities. But again, the folklore goes way back. You know, people were painting, you know, the old Hague stuff, that sleep paralysis was talked about in the English dictionary back in the 1800s. It was first analyzed by neurologists in 1928. Like, so the idea of sleep paralysis goes way, way back. But we just haven't really, I don't think they had the tools to really study it methodologically and scientifically, and actually study what was going on until, you know, several decades ago.
Yeah, well, I mean, there was like there were a lot of folk traditions, and there was, you know, it was something that was represented in art and literature and stuff like that and stuff.
And the medical literature,
but not in medical literature. It was not identified as a sleep paralysis experience until
typically associated with narcolepsy, though. They associated with narcolepsy in 1928, but.
Okay.
Again,
yeah, well, I don't know if, yeah, I'll have to look into that more. Yeah, that's interesting. But
we just didn't have really tools to, like, you know, really study the brain way back when to really figure out what was going on.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I'll have to look into that. Is that maybe you could share the reference behind that with me in the Discord, because I'd like to look into that more. Because, you know, sometimes, you know, I don't, sometimes psychologists, and I mean, Hufford isn't a psychologist, he's a medical researcher, but, you know, he could have been misrepresenting the history there or something like that.
Well, you could have played a role into really kind of coming up with categories and kind of categorizing, and yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so
that should do it.
Yeah, that should do it. Next year, well, next week we're gonna have the final.
We have solved the UFO mystery, guys. You can go home now. That's it.
Well, just wait. You know, a few more weeks. We're gonna share with you all the stuff. We got some people that we talked to, some government officials, and we can't share that yet, though. But
not until whistleblower protections are in place and everything, you know.
Yeah,
we gotta wait.
Yeah, but until then, we're gonna, you know, we just wanted to whistleblow that.
That's right. Okay, it's like my stainless steel saucer.
Yeah.
Isn't that cool?
Mm-hmm. I do like it.
One of these days, I'll set up a proper podcasting station or something, a proper show station, like some people have. When I get some money, I'll even get a real microphone or something.
That's the new X-Files theme. Do. Yeah, so we are kind of soft looking for a new co-host, but you know, it's not a huge priority because we're also going to be eventually having guests, and next year, like I said, things are going to be different next year. It'll be full of surprises. Yes.
Right. Going to work on improving ourselves.
And for our final story tonight, okay, here we go. I'm too exhausted for a final story. This author looked on the internet and found a morass of countless arguments and absolutely terrifying stories undergirded by a pattern of political disunity and fractured narratives, incomprehensible tragedy, complicated injustice, looming threats, and wild contradictions with lives of their own were all over the place. Ambiguity reigned. I interviewed a random European starling on my street without words and only using imaginary psychic communication. I will not repeat the starling's words, for they were quite gratuitous and unpredictable, and we can't have that now, can we? Look at this beautiful picture I made. Isn't it just so pretty? Oh, right, saucers are the new Dada daddy. It all makes sense, people, and that is my perfectly objective description. So please do yourselves a favor, and after the show, go outside, go for a walk, talk to your neighbors, and as they always say nowadays, please, for the love of God, touch some grass.
Touch the grass.
Touch it. Touch the grass.
Do it.
Before we go, if you enjoy this show, we would like you to please consider subscribing to our channel, Ufo Sunset. Please also hit the like button and hit the notification bell icon if you'd like to get notified about upcoming videos, or if you liked the video unrespectively. And come and join our cozy and intimate live chat. A great plus for joining the live chat is that you can give us constructive feedback live on the air, especially if we make any factual errors. You can also join our Discord, a temporary link to which will be found shortly in the episode description. Here at Ufos, our political and personal views are still not the same, and the work of each of us is independent work. Personal views or positions expressed in individual pieces are not those of Ufos, who is not a person and has no views, or the other host, or whichever other host, I'll have to rewrite that. Please be sure to check out our respective content. I can be found inside the earth. You can find Jeff Knox's daily posts on history and the science of UFOs on Twitter or Facebook, or inside of that rubber ducky. Jeff Knox spends all of his time studying UFOs and he doesn't make any money off of it. Please consider visiting his Patreon page and becoming his patron, or visiting his Ko-Fi page and giving him coffee. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you again to Luis Cayetano for all of your contributions. Thank you, Rich and Tim, for joining the chat. Thank you to Kevin for being Jeff's patron. And Quack.
Quack.
Is this the reference that you were talking about?
Yeah.
From 1928? The narcolepsies. Oh, okay. Yeah, okay. I remember David Huffer talking about the history of narcolepsy, so I'll have to review all of that stuff at some point.
Yep.
Anything you'd like to add before we go, Jeff?
Nope. I think that does it.
All right.
Good.
It's just me and the boys. In the words of the disc, this saucer too shall pass. Gas.